So, this is an exploration of what environment means and what exercise physiology means. And we did touch on this a lot in class on Tuesday. We did some brainstorming. What is physiology? How does exercise change our idea of physiology? And what is environment? How does that add another layer of complexity to the topic? So I'll try to explain to you just the general concept that the environment is integrative. It takes many factors and it's the net sum of those factors on the person trying to accomplish a task, trying to perform. We'll look at some common definitions that we often use that are specific to environmental exercise physiology. And then I'll lead you through a basic research plan, how you would research a topic or how you would research a task if you were looking to see what the impacts of the environment were. And this parallels how you might approach your group research project as well, a nice step-by-step approach. So we know from doing the concept map and from your previous experience, exercise physiology has many branches, many subtopics. It's integrative, not just respiratory, not just metabolic. All of these things work together to support the idea of whatever exercise is. Multiple systems are in play. When we take the person or the task out of the lab, all those systems are still in play, but we're adding another layer of complexity because there's external pressure being introduced. There's external stress that impacts how those systems might respond. At altitude, there's an external stress of reduced oxygen availability that might change how the respiratory system responds to exercise. It still responds, but it might be turned up or turned down. Some things might be magnified. So we look at the combined stimuli, and to the best of my abilities, I've tried to break them down into individual topics. So we look at heat only. We look at altitude only. But in actual fact, a lot of the time, these stimuli are combined. Cold and hypoxia often occur together. Heat can be dry. Heat can be humid. What does that mean as far as our ability to regulate body temperature? In extreme cases, microgravity, for instance, unloads all of the systems, or the majority of the systems that are in play when we try to perform a task. You're not working against gravity. A lot of the reason the heart has to pump at such a high level or maintain a high vascular pressure is that gravity is always pulling the blood down towards your feet. Microgravity doesn't have that unfortunate side effect. So the cardiovascular system is unloaded. It doesn't have to work as hard. The muscles don't have to work as hard. Astronauts will often see and experience atrophy in their leg muscles and their postural muscles. Even the nervous connection to muscles is reduced. The ability to excite and turn on and contract the muscle is compromised depending on how long they're in that new environment. And then tropical climates, hot, humid environments impose added stress. The cardiovascular system needs to do a lot more work. You can feel the heat. You can tell you're hot and you're gaining body temperature. It's depressing. It's unmotivating. There's a whole host of other things that add to this burden. But regardless, our goal is to do a job. In sport, it is perform at a high level, run really quickly, be accurate with your shots. The systems always respond to support successful completion of a task, and in many cases, There's stress enough just moving from rest to exercise. But when we add that layer of environment, there's added stress that might push those responses out of their physiological limits or to the limit of their physiologic capacities. In many cases, the body can adapt and respond to complete a task, even with the added burden of certain environments. We can tap into some extra capacity, or we might sacrifice, turn off some other systems that would have caused us to fatigue. But there are limits. You can't always do that. Of course there are limits. VO2 max, one of the best defined, often overlooked for as familiar as we are with it, limits in exercise physiology. There's a limit because we have some finite ability to turn on those systems. If we try to turn them on more, we can't. We fail. You've tried that in minute 12 of your VO2 max test to move up to the next incline on the treadmill. You can't do it. There are limits. So in some situations, the environmental or external stress is too much, and it causes failure. So we want to look at why or how the environment causes failure. And this brings up the idea of what is failure. You'll often think of failure as fatigue, but it can also simply be a reduction in performance or less than normal performance that's suboptimal. There are varying degrees of fatigue, but in the extreme case, you cease to function. You cease to exercise. You can't perform the task altogether. And so between doing your job normally and then this idea, this extreme idea of fatigue, you have an entire spectrum of possibilities. But at the end, fatigue is really defined as a multimodal. There's many different aspects that are graded that describe how unsuccessful we are at completing a task. If we are fatigued, we are unsuccessful. We fail at doing it. But along the way, we can get worse and worse and worse until we reach this point. And we don't actually know what causes fatigue. Still, we argue about it. There was an entire conference dedicated to the physiology of fatigue last year. Is it neural? Is it muscular? Is it the heart? It's pumping too quickly and sending alarm signals to the brain. We don't know. It's probably all of those things. And you can describe fatigue at the muscle. The force that the muscle generates is too small. The muscle as a group can't rotate the limb or close the joint. It can't perform its job. The whole body system might fatigue. You might feel general malaise and weakness. There's no endurance, motivation. The nervous system can't activate muscle groups, or the firing of neurons is reduced. It's not as frequent because we aren't recruiting those nerves. The perception of exercise seems harder. RPE, the rating of perceived exertion, goes up for a given intensity. And all of these things might add to fatigue. We don't know which is the factor. It's probably all of these groups together that progressively fail at doing the job. So I present this so that you're not surprised when we get to a section on altitude, for instance, when we end up saying there's no one right answer. These are the main candidates, and we know this progression happens, but when you fall off a mountain, it's not because of one specific thing. All of these elements work together. So let's talk about a few terms. These are general terms that you might have heard in exercise phys, and we'll color these, add context with environmental exphys terms specifically, and this is a little bit different than the slides that are on Moodle. I added this point because I think this is an important bridge to the next point. A response, as I consider it, is some deviation or change in the human system in the presence of a stress. And we explored those today. You did when you were making your concept maps. What is the response of the cardiovascular system? What is the response of a muscle cell? There's some deviation in normal function, but still within normal limits that allows the body to function in the presence of a stress. If you string together a number of these responses, you might end up with what we call an adaptation. This is a change, a persistent change in the human system in response to a repeated stressor. The training effect is an example of an adaptation. And you can look at adaptations of the muscle, you can look at adaptations of bone, you can look at adaptations of the neuromuscular system or neuromuscular junction, rather. If you continue this adaptation and don't vary the stress, you will reach a point where whatever that stress was is not stressful anymore. Maybe at one point, running 5K was a dream, incredibly difficult, not possible without frequent breaks. As you progress in your training program, 5K is what you do on a Sunday afternoon in your sleep. Habituation is the reduction in the tendency to adapt with exposure to the same stressor. The key here is same. We're not changing the stress. The body has adapted to the stress so that it is no longer a stress. It's habituated. This next idea is very similar. Habituation and acclimation are very similar concepts. But acclimation is a term that we use to specifically refer to adaptation to the environment. It's a set of physiological responses to experimentally induced factors. So if we're in the laboratory and the laboratory's hot and I have you come in every day and exercise in the heat, I'm imposing that heat upon you. It's artificial. And if I'm measuring changes over time and I see changes in your physiology that occur in response to that heat, what I'm describing is your acclimation to that heat, your acclimation to that environment. The heat is a stress at first, but things will happen in your body that make it not a stress down the road. Very similar to the idea of exercise training. This is heat training in this example. Acclimation, set of responses in response to experimentally induced factors. And this is in contrast to acclimatization, which is the exact same thing but in nature. The exact same thing, but the heat stress or the altitude stress is brought on naturally. It's not in a lab, it's not artificial. Instead of coming to the lab to exercise in the heat, you go down to Bermuda to exercise in the heat. That's naturally imposed environmental stress. It's a very small distinction. It doesn't describe a new idea by any means, but it's a sticking point for a lot of environmental exercise physiologists. So knowing the difference between these is important. Maybe it'll be on a midterm. So we have terminology down. How might we approach our understanding of how the system changes in response to these stresses? As with any exercise or any science, any human physiology or study of human physiology, we often want to look first at the acute exposure. If we are a normal, free-living person, what is your response to a stress? What's your response to exercise? Can you tolerate it? What's your response to being exposed to heat? Can you tolerate it? The acute exposure is usually the first step in our development of understanding of how the body responds to a given environmental stress. If we can characterize the acute exposure, we might string multiple acute exposures together in the process of acclimation and try to describe what the chronic adaptations of a person might be. What happens if you're always exposed to the heat? Is it always stressful? Something change within your body that allows you to now experience greater levels of heat, or perhaps perform a task in that environment longer? And for that matter, what is the task? Can we quantify the performance of that task? I might look and see how your heart rate changes, how your RPE changes, how your sweat rate changes, how your reaction time changes. Those are all ways to assess physiological function, but they don't do anything to describe how successful you will be. In order to understand how successful you will be, I need to measure the thing that you're trying to succeed at, the performance of your task. Maybe it's running a marathon. Maybe it's defusing a bomb or fighting a fire or carrying a really heavy load a certain distance. Who knows? Whatever the task is, in sport it's often running quickly, cycling quickly. Can you perform that task? If we have a good understanding of these foundational concepts, now we have the luxury of branching out. We try to describe a set of changes that we apply to everyone. That's all science is, mean plus standard deviation. You've got 10 or 12 individuals in a study. There's this average change, and we say, oh, that's probably what everyone will experience. If you break it down like that, that's kind of foolish, right? No one responds the same way as someone else. There's variability in your ability to perform, in your ability to respond to exposure and adapt to exposure. How variable is it? We have the luxury now to study variability. Maybe we identify people that are specifically at risk, right? Maybe on average, heat exposure isn't a problem for the population, but maybe some people are heat sensitive. Is there a way that we can specifically help that group? How can we identify that group and facilitate their success in that environment? And lastly, what interventions can I impose to change that response? Heart rate spikes. Okay. That's clearly a signal for fatigue. Often when you fatigue, your heart rate is close to your theoretical max. How might I reduce that or prevent the increase in heart rate? How might I slow the increase in heart rate if that's something that I want to do? What countermeasures are in play? If we stay with the example of getting too hot and fatiguing fatiguing in the heat and not being able to perform, maybe I try to cool somebody. Is there a vest or some kind of a water pumping system? Or could they drink an ice slushy or just cold water? Is there a way that I can preserve lower core temperatures, allowing them to work longer? Or for that short window of time, allowing them to perform at their best before they fatigue? What countermeasures can we impose to modify all of the responses that we've observed so far to hopefully maximize task performance? Things like ergogenic aids are included here. Caffeine, creatine, carbohydrates, protein, things like that are countermeasures. And maybe countermeasures isn't the right word. In those cases, they are trying to boost a response. Protein, for instance, wants to increase the gain of muscle mass, the increase in strength. Countermeasures in this sense are trying to reduce the negative impact of heat, dehydration, etc. They all work towards the common goal of improving performance, though. So with this brief roadmap, what do we need to understand moving forward? You as a group need a fundamental understanding of exercise physiology. What is exercise? How does the body allow itself to exercise or to experience and maintain that degree of stress, so that we can look at changes to exercise physiology concepts, branches, systems within the body. In general, we try to keep a fairly wide focus. Some physiologists study only the heart, only the vasculature. Some study only muscle. The environment doesn't only affect the vasculature, it doesn't only affect muscle, and so we often try to include a mention of all systems and integrate that information across multiple sources. Overall, with the goal, the objective of completing a task. So we need to define that task first. We need to understand how the systems within the body allow normal completion of that task. And then if it's changed because of this external pressure, how is it changed, why is it changed, and can we do anything about it? That's in very general terms how we're going to approach all of the sections in this course. How does the normal response change when you're in the heat? How is it influenced by the cold? What if you fall into a freezing ocean? We'll look at all of these things in turn. So any questions? Does this make sense so far? Okay. Let's call it there for today. We'll end a few minutes early. And